Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Fitzmaurice, and today I'll present my Master of Science in Cybersecurity Research that I did over the past 2 years. It was online remote. I work in Galway City Council as information security analysis across the road there. So the topic is generative AI deepfakes, real-world threats to facial biometrics. So I'll run you through today how I was able to create deepfakes using GitHub, open source repositories, community edition software, and spoof Face ID, and then get into...
Increase your volume just a little bit.
Okay, and then get into a Microsoft Authenticator app. So it was actually, the research was published with IEEE Explorer during the week there, Thursday just gone. Presented at the Cyber Research Ireland conference in December 2025. So the motivation and research problem. So came from two directions: real world fraud cases and gaps in academic literature. So on the fraud side, one case really stood out. In Hong Kong in 2023, a finance worker was tricked into transferring the equivalent of $25 million after attending a video call with what looked like their CFO, Chief Financial Officer, and colleagues. In reality, everyone on that call was a deepfake. It's one of the largest corporate losses of deepfake technology ever reported. Just highlights how attackers are now weaponizing generative AI with high-value crimes. Close to home here in Ireland, you've seen manipulated data. For example, deepfakes of political figures being circulated online, AI-generated voices using scam calls or voice cloning. These may not always be as sophisticated as the Hong Kong attack, but shows you the direction of travel. Technology is spreading and becoming more accessible. Just on the deepfake itself, the term derives from the deep part comes from deep learning and machine learning, and the fake is synthetic media. It became a thing in 2017 when a user on Reddit used that term, and stuck ever since. So, why is that relevant to facial biometrics? We just rely on facial biometrics so much, whether it's Face ID on iPhone, facial recognition on Android, or Windows Hello on operating systems on laptops, and even Microsoft Authenticator. So you can see there in screen grabs. So this is what my thesis derives from. The Face ID pop-up appears on screen when you open the app, and then that's the takeover there that when the Face ID actually works. It's something you'll all be used to using every day. That's my student account there that I linked my student account to one of the test devices, which I'll show later on. When I looked into the research, I found a gap. Most academic studies assume deepfakes that the attacker has powerful GPUs, which are commonly known as gaming laptops these days, and cloud resources, which isn't very realistic. Not every attacker is a state actor. Many are ordinary criminals working within limited means. So the question I asked was, if we put ourselves in the shoes of a CPU-only attacker, no GPUs, just the kind of resources most people have, could they generate deepfakes capable of bypassing biometric systems? So tackle that problem broke into two research questions. First is technical. How accurate are deepfakes generated open source tools across different operating systems and hardware conditions? What I mean by that is that if you take the same source data and run it through Deepfakes Lab, FaceSwap, or FaceFusion, which are three deepfake generators, and then put that across different devices and different operating system platforms, how do the results differ? Are deepfakes realistic enough to potentially fool a biometric system? The second question was security driven. Can deepfakes actually bypass Apple Face ID to unlock Microsoft Authenticator, and by extension compromise access to Azure enterprise accounts? This is a critical scenario because the attacker can get through Face ID on iPhone. They can potentially get into the linked Authenticator app on the phone. So what becomes a personal problem can develop into an enterprise issue, security breach. So in short, the first question is about the quality and performance of deepfakes in practice, and the second was about whether they could be weaponized into real-world security systems. So to answer them two research questions, I broke the questions. I set out myself 4 key objectives. First was to evaluate whether deepfakes could bypass live biometric systems in practice, not just in theory, but just like on benchmark data sets, but actually testing against devices like iPhones, Samsung phones, and Windows Hello laptops. The second was to test the effectiveness of state-of-the-art detection tools, specifically Testive and Deepware AI. These tools are often marketed as solutions for enterprises who are worried about deepfakes, but there's very little independent research on how reliable they are when faced with realistic attacks. Third objective is to identify where the weaknesses are. Is it the deepfake tools themselves that make the difference? Is it the device hardware or the environmental conditions like lighting or playback quality for injection attacks? Understanding this helps us know where deepfake defenses should be focused. Finally, I wanted to make a practical recommendations. So for both technology and policy, if deepfakes are already able to bypass biometric systems in certain scenarios, how do we make the authentication systems more resilient? What kind of policy or regulatory support is needed to keep up with the emerging threats? So before running through my own experiments, I looked at what literature said about deepfake and biometric security, as is. On the generation side, deepfakes are usually produced using generative adversarial networks, commonly known as GANs, and more recently diffusion models. These technologies have massively improved the realism. We've gone from blurry, uncanny outputs a few years ago to near photorealistic faces today. So in terms of attack methods, the literature identifies a range of approaches: face swaps, lip syncing, identity transfer, and even fully synthetic characters. Some of these are more convincing than others, but all present challenges for detection. On the defensive side, there is a lot of proposed detection methods: analysing spatial artifacts in the image, looking for temporal inconsistencies across frames, or using frequency analysis to spot subtle anomalies. More recently, biometric based detectors that analyse eye movements or micro expressions have also been tested. So the gap is that most of these studies are lab based, trained on data sets like face forensics, and they rarely test against actual deployed systems like iPhone Face ID or Microsoft Authenticator. Face forensics is a benchmark data set from Meta, Facebook. It's one of the most studied data sets of faces out there. So my data set was all my own face and GDPR ethical reasons. So that doesn't really necessarily reflect on what happens in the real world when a deepfake is played back in a biometric sensor. That's where my research comes in, from moving from lab data sets to real world systems. So my research, the 4 main contributions of it, was carried out on a cross-environmental analysis using 3 open source deepfake generators: Deepfakes Lab, Face Fusion, and Face Swap. Each of these tools had different strengths and weaknesses, and by testing across different devices, operating systems, I was able to compare their effectiveness in practice. Second, built my own private data biometrics data set. In other words, I use only my own facial data to train the models. This kept the research ethical, GDPR compliant, while still reducing realistic results. Third, and probably the most significant, demonstrated an end-to-end multi-factor authentication bypass scenario. So that means using a deepfake to spoof Apple Face ID and then unlock the Microsoft Authenticator app, and then in turn provide access to Azure enterprise accounts. This shows how a personal biometric weakness can cascade into enterprise level compromise. Finally, I modelled the attack under CPU only conditions. This is important because most research assumes the attacker has powerful GPUs. I wanted to test a more realistic attacker. Someone using just the resources available on a standard PC or laptop. And as I'll show later, even with under these constraints, deepfakes are still able to bypass biometrics in some scenarios. So, the threat model. To make the research clear and reproducible, I defined a simple threat model. The attacker's goal is straightforward. Unauthorized access to a device or account using synthetic media. So the main attack vector I considered was video injection or replay attacks, as was also known as. In other words, playing back a pre-generated deepfake clip on a target device's camera. And the targets were systems that only rely on single-factor facial authentication. So Apple Face ID, Android Face Unlock, and Windows Hello. These are widely used by individuals and enterprise contexts. Visually, you could think of this, of the attack chain as attacker, deepfake, tool, target device, and authenticator, which in this case is Azure. So if the attacker succeeds at the Face ID stage, they potentially gain access to everything linked to the authenticator app. This threat model keeps the research focused and realistic and illustrates why the problem matters beyond just one device. The risk cascades from a single bypass into enterprise level compromise. So the methodology followed a fairly structured process. First I started with the data collection. So since I want to keep ethical and GDPR compliant, I used only my own facial biometrics. This meant capturing video samples of my face in controlled conditions, different lighting and angles, so that I could train the deepfake models. Second, I selected 3 open source deepfake tools: Deepfakes Lab, Face Fusion, and Face Swap. These were chosen because they're accessible to the average attacker. Each has a developer community that's active, and each represents a different balance of usability, realism, and performance. And then third, I trained the generated deepfake clips. Key design choice here was to keep everything CPU only. No GPUs were allowed, no cloud servers. The idea was to replicate what a limited but determined, resource limited and determined attacker could actually do at home. Fourth, I tested these clips against live biometric systems. So I used the iPhone 11 with Face ID and several Samsung models and Android Face Unlock and Windows Hello on 2 laptops. On the enterprise chain, I linked the iPhone Face ID to Microsoft Authenticator and Azure. So on one of the test devices, iPhone 11, I re-registered my student account with multi-factor authentication and switched from my own personal phone, which is a Samsung S23 Ultra, to an iPhone 11 mobile phone. So finally I evaluated the results in 3 ways: whether the spoof attempt succeeded, whether detection tools like Attestive or Deepware AI flagged it, on my own qualitative review of the artifacts and realism. So once the design was set, I moved to the implementation. So I generated 10-second clips, video clips, simulating login attempts. These were long enough to trigger Face ID, but short enough to train efficiently on a CPU laptop. All training was carried out on CPU-only machine. This was deliberately restrictive, but it allowed me to answer the question: can an attacker with just a normal laptop produce a convincing deepfake? As I generated the clips, I noticed several artifacts. Things like poor blending at the edges of the face, mismatched scaling, where the fake face didn't perfectly align, or frame instability that caused flickering. These artifacts varied by tool. Deepfakes Lab, for example, produced higher fidelity outputs but with longer training times, while Face Fusion produced rougher visuals but much faster production. Finally, I stored all the data handling. I made sure all the data handling was ethical. Everything was stored locally, encrypted, and never uploaded to the cloud. This is important not just for compliance, but attackers in the wild may prefer local methods to avoid detection. So the most striking findings here now was the Face Fusion. Even though it produced the least polished visuals, It had the highest spoof success rate, up to 63% on iPhone 11 Face ID. Deepfakes Lab was slower to train, but moderately successful, with around 23% success rate. Face Swap was a surprise. It actually produced some of the cleanest visuals, but achieved 0% success rate across all tests. This shows what looks good to the human eye doesn't always necessarily fool biometric systems, and vice versa. I also tested on newer Samsung devices like the S21 FE, S23 Ultra, and here the success rates dropped to near zero. So these newer devices integrate multi-sensor hardware and liveness detection, which make them much more resilient. So they have like 3D scanners instead of 2D scanners in some of the older legacy hardware. So the key takeaway is that older devices remain vulnerable, while newer devices are far more resilient. So I also tested the detection tools. So I ran all the deepfake outputs through these two tools. So the main finding was the detection is inconsistent. Sometimes the test of our deeper AI caught the deepfakes, while other times they let them through. So interestingly, the realism doesn't always equal success. Some very polished fakes were still blocked, while some poor quality ones slipped through. This suggests that biometric systems and detectors are sensitive to different signals. Device differences also mattered. The exact deepfake clip could spoof an iPhone but fail against a Samsung device. That underlines how much hardware variation affects outcomes. Bottom line is detection tools alone are unreliable. They miss cases, they produce false negatives, and they're inconsistent enough to serve as the only line of defense. So we need to switch from single-factor authentication to two or multi-factor authentication. So these are my outputs. Examples of some of the deepfakes I created. So they're the three deepfake generators: GFL, Face Swap, and Face Fusion. So on the left, you'll see the Deepfakes Lab output. Fairly realistic, but we're blending artifacts around the jawline. So just before I created my deepfakes, I had 90-second clips. So through my webcam, HD webcam, I would have just moved my head left, right, up, down, blinked, done as many facial expressions as if like you recorded 90 seconds off a Teams call with someone, let's say, for example. So to make it as different as possible, I wore different t-shirts, and I had a mustache in one of them and clean shave in the other one, and I merged the two of them together. So the source had clean shaven, and then the destination file had a mustache, and then the two of them merged together to create the deepfake, and that's what you get. So in the middle then, the face swap, this looks clean visually, but again, remember this had a zero success in practice. On the right, Face Fusion looks less polished with some distortion, but ironically this was the most successful in spoofing Face ID. So this just illustrates the important point that aesthetic realism doesn't always predict security risk, and what fools us as human isn't necessarily what fools algorithms, and vice versa. So you can see there, I'd say on the Face Fusion, the far right one, my front two teeth, the bottom, see the anomalies and the frames, it doesn't pick up, like it's not as color coded in, you could say. Forehead too, extra wrinkles are nearly put in. So Face Fusion ran with AI, that generated around 7 hours. Face Swap in the middle, you're talking up to maybe 12 hours for that. Deepfakes Lab, CPU, this crashed to me night and day. This was 24 hours, leaving the laptop outside the bedroom. Task manager was exploding. So you can see here, this was done command line. Face Swap was done on just download off GitHub, the tool, and then Face Fusion was Pinocchio AI app launcher. So this is actually like a mask. So you can see my forehead there. You probably see it better than me, going up too close to it. But this is like a Halloween mask, you could say, and it just puts that onto the face. So you can see like I tried to merge the lines between the forehead and the mask there to try to make it as realism. This was done by my eye, and the rest were done done by AI. So another key finding was that CPU-only performance under CPU-only conditions. So Face Fusion was by far the fastest, producing deepfakes in around 6 hours of training. Face Swap, middle range, Deepfakes Lab, slowest, taking over 24 hours to produce one model. So there's a trade-off here. So higher visual fidelity at a higher cost, while Face Fusion is faster and actually more effective in spoofing. So takeaway is that CPU-only attackers are still viable. Even without a GPU, an attacker can realistically train deepfakes that bypass certain biometric systems. So it means in practice that we've shown that the first CPU-only attacks are feasible under certain conditions. That challenged the assumption that deepfakes attacks also require high-end GPUs or cloud infrastructure. Second, we've demonstrated that the enterprise MFA chains can be vulnerable. If Face ID can be spoofed, that doesn't always give access to the phone. It can unlock authenticator apps linked to it, and from there, enterprise logins like Azure, PIN codes, password resets, possibilities. That means the risk cascades from individual to enterprise level. Third, we've seen detection tools are not reliable enough. Neither Attestive or Deepware AI consistently caught the fakes. That means detection alone is not a sufficient safeguard. Finally, there's a clear policy gap. The pace of generative AI is far ahead of the EU and Irish regulation. The European AI Act's moving in the right direction, but still hasn't addressed the practical risk of biometric spoofing with deepfakes. That leaves individuals exposed. Broader implication is that security has to evolve beyond single-factor biometrics. We need layered defenses, multi-factor authentication that doesn't just rely on single face scan, detection tools combined with hardware checks, and stronger policy frameworks to guide deployment. So to wrap up, my research, the 4 contributions. First, provides one of the first empirical ethical studies of deepfake attacks under CPU-only conditions, showing what was realistically possible for a low resource attacker. Second, findings confirm the possibilities exist, but the outcomes vary by device and environment. Older devices like the iPhone 11 are much more at risk than newer devices with multi-sensor security, and they're far more resilient. Third, the implications are clear. Single-factor biometrics are not enough. If deepfakes and bypass Face ID even occasionally, like we hit 67% on the iPhone 11. That means that additional layers of security are necessary. And finally, identified several directions for future work. If there's a PhD there, if you want it, expanding the data set to include more faces and demographics, since my study focused only on my own biometrics. Benchmarking GPU-based and commercial deepfake tools to see how much stronger they are compared to open source, and then CPU methods. Test the next generation deepfakes like chimeric faces or impossible faces that don't exist in reality but may pose even greater challenges to biometrics. So impossible faces is a face that's it's not someone's face in the world out of the 7 billion people, but AI creates a new face that's never been seen before. That's what impossible face is. So in short, my work shows that deepfakes are a genuine emergent threat to biometric systems, but it also points to the steps we need to take to strengthen security. Also, if you can hack the Face ID, like you have your Google Wallet, you have everything. I kept it enterprise level, so that's why I went to Microsoft Authenticator. You and I, we're in on the IT industry space. We probably keep up to date with the latest phones, but iPhone 11s and phones of that generation are still in the wide public domain. That is a massive security risk, especially companies that aren't using work phones. They're using, they get their employees to use personal phones to use 2FA. And it's also important to check the security updates. So, iPhone 11, security updates stopped. So, if you go into security and about and see when your security updates are, and then if it's security updates are expired, the phone needs to go, especially from a enterprise level. So, key takeaway then is the deepfakes pose a realistic but inconsistent threat to facial biometrics. Layered security is essential. that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thanks for your attention and opportunity to share this work. I went live there on Thursday 2 days ago with IEEE Explorer. I published it as a conference paper. So if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to take them. Just fire ahead.